This is 9/11, 10 years after, from WMAL and the museum, where history lives. Here is Torie Clarke.
I'm very pleased to be joined by my old boss, former Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld. And Mr. Secretary, I tell everybody, I always divide my life at the Pentagon. I always say, well, there was pre-9/11, in which we talked about the kinds of things that might happen in general terms and how people need to be prepared for a very different world. And then there was post-9/11, in which we were dealing with the reality. But take us back to where you were that morning, that spectacularly beautiful day in Washington, and where you were that morning in the Pentagon and what you were doing.
Well, I was in my conference room right next to my office, meeting with some members of Congress who were worried about voting for too large an increase in the defense budget because they were talking about something mythical called the Social Security lockbox. And they were concerned about that. Apparently it had become an issue. And I said to them, look, at some point, 6, 8, 10, 12 months down the road, something's going to happen in this world of ours, and you're not going to want to be in a position of having not supported an appropriate increase to begin correcting the deficiencies that occurred during the Clinton administration and the last 2 years of the Bush administration, the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, after the end of the Cold War, where we retrenched and we skimped on defense, we skimped on intelligence. And the meeting ended, and Admiral Giambastiani came in and mentioned that a plane had hit the World Trade Center.
This was the first plane.
Yeah.
And you're a former pilot, what did you think when you heard that, about the first plane?
What a terrible accident. Just a horrible thing. And then he turned the television on, and we could see the beginnings of what was taking place. And I then had a intelligence briefing with my CIA briefer, and the next thing I knew, he came in and said another plane's hit the World Trade Center. And, of course, at that point, it was not an accident. It was an attack on America. And shortly thereafter, the Pentagon shook. And needless to say, we discontinued my CIA briefing, and I went down the hall to try to see what had happened. And
did you think another plane? I
did, either that or a bomb.
Right.
It was of that magnitude. And I ran into a disheveled lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, and he said to me he had seen the plane hit the Pentagon. By this time I was going downstairs because the smoke was so bad, and went outside. And once he told me that, I turned the corner, and there was this smoke and flame and people running out of the building, burned, and people trying to help other people. There were no first responders there then.
And you're helping because you were one of the first responders.
For a short period, I did, until then crowds began to gather, and they were pitching in, civilians and military alike. And I went back to the office, as you know well.
Right.
And you were there, as I recall.
Right. Yeah, I've always thought you could often compartmentalize so well and be thinking about 3 different things at once. What were you thinking about that time, about the sort of the near term, what had to be done right then, versus what this meant for the country and how we would have to start changing to adapt to what had just happened?
Well, the first thing that came to mind, of course, was what happened to the building and to the people who were burning, and how what needed to be done immediately there. By the time I got back to my office, that was not my thought. My thought was that we had been attacked in New York at the seat of our economic, an attack in the Pentagon at the seat of American military power, and that there were a lot of airplanes in the air, and that I would best get talking to the president and the vice president and the senior military people and get a status report on what was taking place, because it was entirely possible that there could be another attack of some type. We got on the phone, and I remember talking to the vice president and talking to Condi Rice and people over in the White House, and then shortly thereafter, Dick Myers, who'd been up on Capitol Hill making courtesy calls to get confirmed as chairman of the...
Right, he was vice chairman at the time.
Arrived in the building, and of course others were out of the country. Colin Powell was out of the country, General Shelton was out of the country. George Tenet called at some point that morning and said that he had very good reason to believe it was Al-Qaeda. And, of course, by then we were getting reports of airplanes squawking hijack. Some accurate, some inaccurate.
Right.
But it turned out that thanks to the courage of the folks that crashed that plane into Shanksville in Pennsylvania, the seat of our political power wasn't hit that day. And God bless them for making that valiant attempt to take over the aircraft.
Right. So when you were meeting with those members of Congress, you were talking a lot about how the world has changed. We may not be really focused on it in a very visible way, but the world has changed, and we're going to need to train and equip and fight differently, and much more likely we'll face asymmetrical kind of threats. That's what we called them pre-9/11, and then we called them the war. We called it the war on terror. How quickly and how well do you think we adapted and changed?
I think rather well. Big governments and bureaucracies are slow to change generally, and the President, of course, had come into office determined to have the Department of Defense adjust and transform itself so that it could function successfully on behalf of the American people in the 21st century and in the information age. He'd made speeches about that as a candidate for president. One of them was memorable at the Citadel. And so when he asked me to come into office, that was my assignment, was to try to begin to get the Department of Defense looking forward and recognizing that we would not likely be facing traditionally conventional threats immediately. There were not countries that had the kinds of capabilities at that time that could threaten us from a standpoint of big armies, navies, and air forces. So we had to be able to deal with, as you mentioned, unconventional or asymmetrical threats, and we began working on that. After 9/11, a lot of people said, "Well, that ends that. The war on terror will take the place of trying to transform the Department of Defense." As it turned out, it was quite the opposite. The fact of 9/11 provided a stimulus, an impetus to transforming the department, and we were able to make a lot of exceedingly important adjustments in how the department functioned and the kinds of capabilities. I mean, we moved from divisions to brigades. We increased dramatically the number of unmanned aerial vehicles or drones. We put in a national security personnel system that enabled the department to function more readily. We began to privatize some of the military housing and were able to expand it quite significantly. We rebalanced our forces across the world and went from a leftover of the Cold War posture to a posture that enabled us to move much more effectively, rapidly, and with greater lethality than was the case previously. So there were just a lot of things we were able to do because of the impetus that 9/11 provided.
Right. Could have been. I remember hearings, again, pre-9/11, post-9/11. Pre-9/11, you're testifying or meeting with members of Congress, and you would make a very, to many people, a strong, convincing case about the need for change. And as I put it, not you, as I put it, they would almost reach down and pat you on the head and go, "Well, that's very nice, Mr. Secretary. Now let's talk about how many aircraft carriers you're going to build in my backyard."
Yeah.
But 9/11 gave them the reality they couldn't avoid. Now, go back to your confirmation hearing, and I remember one of the most important questions you were asked was essentially, what are you really worried about? What would you lose sleep over? And you said intel. So talk a little...
Senator Roberts of Kansas,
right,
who asked me that, and I did. I said that I was worried about our ability to know what's going on in the world. We had studied the Soviet Union for decades and gotten so that we were pretty good at it, although we were still imperfect. But the nature of the world in the year 2001 was notably different. And I knew that our intelligence had been skimped on during the previous decade after the end of the Cold War, and I was worried about it.
Well, you've talked about how we've improved and adapted and transformed militarily. How have we done in the intel space?
I guess time will tell. We're better than we were. We have increased the budgets. We've increased the capabilities. It takes a long time to develop the kinds of human assets that are necessary in the world we live in. But we're dealing with closed societies. We're not dealing in every case with nations, but networks of people. We're dealing with people who don't have real estate to defend, or bureaucracies to defend, or free press. Indeed, they have the advantage of being able to lie repeatedly and have it still carried on the airwaves through all the various forms of media. And the lie travels around the world 50 times, as they say, before the truth even gets its boots on to begin to correct it.
Which is really true today in the era of Twitter and blogs and everything else.
Oh, my goodness, yes. The big advantage today, of course, is back in those days there were only, back in the early days during the Cold War, there were only 2 or 3 or 4 networks. And now today there are multiple sources of information. And while errors don't get corrected and people don't like to admit mistakes, there is at least an opportunity to get the message out that is accurate.
Who has, with all these advances, and I guess improvements, I use the word loosely, in information technologies, all this incredible information technology that is available to almost anybody, is that a competitive advantage for the bad guys more than us?
Well, they certainly take advantage of it. They have media committees, Al-Qaeda does, and they sit down and plan, and they mastermind lies like Goebbels did, the things they can say that are inaccurate, but that appeal to various forms of media that then get promoted and promulgated throughout the globe.
Right.
They trained their Al-Qaeda operatives to immediately contend that they were tortured and abused, and they were quite successful in doing that, and that gets repeated over and over and over again, and how do you disprove that?
Right.
Except through a lengthy legal process.
So about this time, I remember right after 9/11, one of the information concerns we had, or challenges we had, is we were actually a little bit worried in a strange way that we might actually get bin Laden right away. And the concern was if you get him right away, then a lot of people would just want to check out and say, okay, we got that done, we got the bad guy who did this horrible thing to us, and they wouldn't realize the long struggle that lay ahead. So it takes almost 10 years, and we got bin Laden. What did you think when you heard he had been killed? And, this is my favorite question, would you rather he had been captured than killed?
Well, what did I feel? I felt that the world was a better place. Here was the head of a terrorist organization that had killed 3,000 people in one fell swoop, and thousands more over a period of time. He was the face of terror. He was very successful in funding and recruiting, and in planning and masterminding. So the world's a better place with him gone. I wouldn't even think about second guessing as to whether it would have been better to have him captured or killed. You know, those folks went in at night in a difficult situation, and they don't know what kind of booby traps exist or suicide bombers, and they have to react in a second. And my guess is it's just as well that he's dead, and certainly those folks did a fine job, and thanks to the efforts everyone has made over the past decade, today the special operations budget is probably doubled, and the numbers of people are up by about 50%, and their authorities we increased significantly, and they clearly are the finest, most capable fighting force on the face of the earth.
Yeah, I saw Stan McChrystal not too long ago, and we were talking, and I was asking him how his life has changed and how he thought special ops had changed, and he says, if you had told me 10 years ago how dramatically we could have changed, how mature we could have gotten. And he talked specifically about, the ability to get information in a more timely fashion, and then he said, as importantly, the ability to act on that information very quickly. Yeah. He just thought it gave them a huge advantage.
His folks in Afghanistan and Iraq were able to get a scrap of information, move on it in the evening early, find information on the target they attacked first, use the information from that target to attack another one the same evening.
Right. So legislation has been introduced to reconstitute, that's my word, not theirs, to reconstitute the 9/11 Commission. And what would you want them looking at 10 years later? Or if you were going to set up your own commission or have Congress really focus on something that looks ahead, what would you want them to focus on?
Well, in my book, I talk about the fact that the institutions we have were really fashioned at the inflection point at the end of the Cold War. And that's 50 years ago, plus. And they've not been dramatically adjusted to fit the information age.
Right.
On my website, Rumsfeld.com, I put I guess close to 3,500 to 4,000 documents, that one of which is the memo I sent the President on the subject of looking forward and the possibility of fashioning a new Hoover Commission to look at the international institutions and the domestic institutions and ask the question, are the ones that have served us since the end of the Cold War, the end of World War II, during the Cold War,
right,
still the appropriate ones? And if you think back, we in the late 1940s in the Truman administration, we fashioned the CIA, the Department of Defense, the National Security Council, the USIA, all of those. And internationally, it was the United Nations, NATO, the IMF, the World Bank. All of those things happened in that period. Well, we hit a new inflection point at the end of the Cold War, and we've not seriously addressed those things. I would much rather see a commission sit down and look at those things to see how we can get the United States government, which is inherently big and slow and clumsy and 9 to 5 in its operations, adapted. It's equally true on the international institutions. If there's anything that's obvious, it's that the United Nations is not successful in dealing with important international issues.
Right. And I was always struck, even in the early days after 9/11, how clearly our ability to succeed on the national security front clearly wasn't just the Pentagon. It wasn't even just the Pentagon and the CIA. It was what the folks at Treasury were doing, what the folks at Justice were doing, and a much more multifaceted approach to national security. But there was very little jointness of those different entities. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But I always wondered if you couldn't somehow do the national security version of Goldwater-Nichols, which creates a greater jointness in the military, if you couldn't do something like that to create a greater, more comprehensive and more consistent national security approach in the federal government.
And I think that's exactly right. And clearly part of the problem is the Congress. They've got these committees and subcommittees that are very turf-conscious and unwilling to work together, that control the different bureaucracies and almost require that they behave in ways that are distinctly different from each other, rather than those threads coming up through a needlehead in a reasonably coherent fashion so that the president can make a rational decision.
Right.
There's competition in there, which is unfortunate.
Right. Okay, next to last question. You are eternally an optimistic guy. When it's 10 years later and we're looking forward, what are you most pessimistic about and what are you most optimistic about in terms of our national security and the defense of the country?
Well, I guess the things that would leap to mind would be that we have been enormously successful as a nation. No one would have dreamt 10 years ago that we could have lasted a decade without another successful terrorist attack on our country that conceivably could have been not 3,000 dead, but 300,000 dead, given the lethality of weapons. So we have to be optimistic and grateful that some of the structures that have been put in place and by the Bush administration and kept in place by the Obama administration have served the country well.
Right.
The Patriot Act and Guantanamo Bay and military commissions and indefinite detention and the concern that we were in a new era and we had to change the way we were dealing with terrorists and not simply think they were common criminals that we could indict in absentia in a New York court and feel good about. We had to do something different, and that meant we had to put pressure on them. So I think that we ought to credit that as something that that suggests that the United States government has behaved rather well. I suppose the other side of the coin is the worrisome one, and what you worry about is we have gotten away with making mistakes as a country throughout my adult life. At the end of World War II, we took a deep breath and said, well, that's that. The world's safe for democracy.
Right.
And we can now cut the defense budget and the intelligence budget. Then comes Korea, and we have to wrap it up. And then we take another deep breath and cut it. And then comes Vietnam, and we take another deep breath and cut it. And we're about ready to make the same mistake again. And one could say, well, we got away with it each of those times. We did it at the end of the Cold War. We cut it. And cut the intel budgets, cut the defense budget dramatically, and hollowed out the military and hollowed out our intelligence capabilities. Now, because of the debt crisis, which is enormously important, we're about to do the same thing. And the problem is it's different today. The lethality of weapons today is so vastly greater than it was in those earlier periods, that we don't have the luxury of making that same mistake again. And you can hear Democrats, Republicans, conservatives, liberals, all saying we've got to balance the budget, and a lot of them mindlessly suggesting that the place to begin and to deal with the problem is in the defense budget. When I came to Washington in the Eisenhower administration, the defense budget was 10% of the gross domestic product of our country. Today it's less than 4%. The debt is not coming from the Defense Department. The debt is from entitlements. And if this country makes that same mistake again, we are putting at risk not 3,000 people because of poor intelligence, but 300,000 people. And that is what we have to understand. And we have to go after entitlements. We have to go over where the spending is really causing the debt and deficit problem, and not think we can balance the budget off the Defense Department, because it's physically not possible.
Right. Many people we've talked to for this series have raised the same matter, saying, looking at the economic security, lack thereof, vulnerability, and people's intent to go after the DoD budget. And they said almost the exact same thing. Not as articulately, of course. Okay, last question, or last opportunity. It's 10 years later, and people, the average American, they've got lives. They're getting their kids worried about school the next day. They've got football games to watch. But you'd want to ask them to just stop for a couple of minutes and reflect on this anniversary. And if you're talking to them, what would you want them to reflect on in this day? If they just stop and think for a couple of minutes of the importance of this anniversary, what would you want them to be thinking about?
The most valuable thing that human beings can have is peace, and an opportunity for them to live their lives and in a way that they prefer to live their lives. And here in our country, we're free people, and we like to be able to say what we think and do what we think and go where we think. And the way to have peace is through strength, as Dwight Eisenhower said. And we simply have to recognize that there's a eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And we as a society can't think that it will just happen. It won't just happen. The minute the United States begins to think that, we put our people, the American people, at great risk. And how fortunate we are to be a country that offers those kinds of freedoms and those kinds of opportunities for people. And let's make darn sure that we as the people see that the next generation has those same benefits and opportunities.
Excellent words, Mr. Secretary. Thank you very, very much. Thanks for doing this with us. Please give my best to JR, the family, the dogs, everybody. Thanks, sir. I'll talk to you soon.
Terrific, Torie.
This is 9/11, 10 years after. From WMAL.